There are moments that come to the world not with thunder, but with the sudden quieting of all movement. As the final days of November approach, such a moment is drawing near to America like a shadow stretching across the horizon, not distorted, not loud, only steadily growing. From the 25th of November to the 2nd of December, 7 days are said to touch the heart of this nation's economy and then leave behind an emptiness like the ground after a powerful tide has pulled away. People call it the week of blackout, a mass blackout, a series of days when the hands that once kept the economic machine turning now step away from their old rhythm. No working, no consuming, no entering the brightly lit stores, no chasing the discount numbers that have become a holiday ritual. A deliberate silence spreading across the cities like a wind passing over a desert where even the sand no longer wishes to rise. What is remarkable lies not only in the action, but in the timing, for these 7 days sit right in the middle of Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, the days this land treats as the harvest season of consumerism. A time when eyes follow products more than prayers, when the word blessing dissolves into the sound of barcode scanners and bags filled to the brim. In a season considered sacred by tradition, but restless with material desire, such a silence carries the weight of a sign. When stores expect massive revenue, when streets that are normally crowded become suddenly open, a question emerges light but deep, whether this silence is merely a social reaction or if some invisible thread is being woven through the event. In moments like this, history sometimes arrives not through something new, but through reminders of what was written long ago in another place, in a book that has existed for thousands of years, where prophecies stand still yet never sleep. Many modern disruptions carry echoes of the old, like footsteps once heard in an ancient desert, like the aftershocks of a vision not yet fulfilled. And sometimes, amid the rush of headlines, the listener senses something that does not belong to politics or economics, but to a deeper layer of the human story. When observing the wave of people preparing for the blackout week, the image evokes passages that speak of a time when the people were called out of a system worn down by greed and injustice, not by shouting, but by withdrawing from cycles that no longer held life. There are old writings that warned of a city called Babylon, where wealth was built on the backs of those who were unseen. And when the time came, the people were called out not to flee, but to stop feeding a place already burning itself from within. It is difficult to deny that in recent years, America has witnessed a deeper fracture between rich and poor, between those who benefit and those who carry the burden. The numbers, the policies, the debates all combine into a sigh many hold in their chest. The blackout week, with simple actions like stopping purchases or slowing labor, suddenly carries the tone of a response, a whisper that it is time to look again at who truly keeps the machine alive and what the machine has returned to them in exchange. And as often happens in stories with a sacred thread, no one can say for certain what began first, the weariness of the people or a calling from a deeper place. All that is seen is that the movement grows, spreads, and touches the hearts of those who once thought they were unrelated. For many, the 7 days of silence become not only a civic act, but a mirror held up to the soul, asking how much life has been given to things that never return peace. Therefore, the opening of this story invites the listener to step back to see the mass blackout as a broader landscape where society, history, and prophecy intersect. Without rushing to praise or criticize, simply listening to the flow of these 7 days to see whether in that silence lies something that was once foretold. And as the first door opens, the story will lead gradually into deeper layers of a departure from Babylon, not only through action, but through the awakening of each soul.
When the ancient words come out of her, "My people rise again through the dust of time," they do not sound like a command shouted from a distant heaven. They move more like a quiet current beneath the surface of a trembling world, calling hearts rather than forcing hands. As the days of the mass blackout draw near, that same current stirs across America, not with panic, but with an awakening sense that a turning point is passing through the nation.
Revelation chapter 18, verse 4, is not recited here as a long passage, but as a pulse, a reminder that leaving Babylon was never merely a physical departure. It has always been the moment when a people recognize the chains woven into their daily habits, their labor, their spending, their silent agreements with systems that reward the few and exhaust the many. Babylon in scripture was not only a city, it was a pattern, design of wealth built on the backs of the forgotten.
It was a structure of power that demanded endless output from those who had no space to breathe. It was a place where greed became culture and where human beings were treated as currency long before coins were ever minted. And every empire since then has repeated the pattern, each adding its own ornaments while keeping the same foundations. When one looks at the economic landscape of modern America through that ancient lens, the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Wealth has climbed into towers of unimaginable height, while the ground beneath holds families choosing between medicine and food. Corporations harvest record profits, while workers carry anxiety like a second skin. The distance between rich and poor has become a canyon, carved not by nature but by decisions repeated over generations. For many, participation in this economy has never been a choice, but a requirement for survival. Yet there is a strange irony in that, because the very people who struggle the most are the ones whose spending keeps the machine alive. They turn the gears even when those gears give them nothing back. And when a nation celebrates its grandest shopping rituals, the same hands that carry debt and burden are asked to carry the entire weight of holiday consumption. That is why the coming mass blackout is not simply a moment of protest, it's a withdrawal of consent, is the first breath taken outside the furnace. When millions decide to step away from the economic altar for 7 days, they are not just tightening their budgets, they are answering a call that echoes from the oldest pages of scripture, a call to step out of a system that no longer sees them as human souls, but as streams of revenue. Stepping out of Babylon is not only about withholding money from corporations or slowing the constant flow of labor. It is also the quiet work of turning inward and recognizing the Babylon that has settled inside. For every empire built on exploitation, there is a reflection of it within the human heart, where desire reaches without limit and consumes without question. This inner Babylon shows itself in unnecessary purchases made to fill emotional emptiness, in the hunger for possessions meant to prove worth, in the fear of lacking that drives people into cycles of debt. The blackout becomes a mirror in that sense. It reveals not only how the system operates, but also how deeply it has rooted itself within individuals. The 7 days of economic silence offer something rarer than protest. They offer space to watch how habit tries to pull the hand back to the store, space to see how anxiety rises when consumption stops, space to understand that withdrawal from Babylon is both an outer and inner act, reorientation of what one believes is necessary for life. As the days approach, the movement spreads quietly like a wind through a sleeping forest. It does not shout revolution. It whispers clarity. It invites the weary to take one step outside the noise and see what remains when the lights of Babylon flicker. And now, as you listen to these words, a question rises for you, the listener who has stayed through this unfolding moment. Do you feel the call stirring anywhere in your own life, urging you to step back from the places where you have given too much of your strength, your money, or your peace? If you sense even a small movement inside, know that you are not alone. Know that this moment reaches toward you as well. Thank you for being here, for listening with a heart awake, for allowing this quiet truth to pass through you. Your presence matters more than you realize. When the ancient story of Exodus rises before the inner eye, it does not appear as a distant tale locked in the far corners of history. It appears as a pattern, a living rhythm, repeating through nations and ages, resurfacing whenever a people who have carried the weight of an empire begin to feel the quiet stirring of release. In Egypt, the children of Israel endured hundreds of years in bondage, their bodies driving the very engine that powered the kingdom. Their hands shaped the bricks, lifted the stones, and built the monuments that reflected Egypt's glory back upon itself. Their labor filled the granaries, sustained the wealth of Pharaoh, and kept the great machine of the nation pulsing without pause. They were not seen yet. Everything they touched was seen. They possessed no ownership yet. The empire stood upon their strength. And when the time of departure came, it was not only a story of chains falling away, it was the story of a nation watching its own lifeblood walk out through its gates. Egypt could not imagine an exodus because Egypt believed its control was eternal. But when the people were called to step out, they took with them not just their families, but the wealth their labor had produced for generations. What walked into the desert was not a crowd of former slaves. It was the economic engine of the empire leaving its furnace. And when the footsteps faded into the wilderness, the empire felt the hollowness left behind. This is the pattern. When the oppressed step away, the structures built upon their effort begin to shake. This same rhythm echoes through American history, though the scenery changed from Nile fields to southern plantations and later to corporate towers rising toward the sky. The story of Black America, bound first in physical chains and later in economic ones, mirrors the ancient shape of Israel in ways too deep to be accidental. From the plantation fields where bodies were controlled without mercy to the factories and service industries where labor remained cheap while profits soared upward, the pattern did not break. It mutated. Slavery turned into debt. Chains turned into wages too small to breathe in. Overseers turned into executives who never see the faces of those carrying their burden. And yet, through every variation of this pattern, the same truth remained. The prosperity of the system depended on the endurance of the oppressed. Behind every towering skyline and every surge of economic growth stands a history of hands that were never compensated for the worlds they built. It is this echo of Egypt that makes the coming mass blackout feel like more than a social moment. It has the shape of a new exodus, not one that crosses a physical sea, but one that crosses an economic one, a sea made of numbers and habit and silent obedience. Instead of stepping between walls of water, millions are preparing to step between the walls of their own restraint, stepping out of the cycle that has fed the machine for far too long. The Red Sea of this age is not made of waves. It is made of financial currents, and every decision to withhold labor or pause spending becomes a footstep on dry ground, a path through what once seemed impossible to cross. In this unfolding exodus, the choice to save money becomes an act of liberation. The decision to walk past the glitter of holiday sales becomes a declaration that one will no longer be shaped by the commands of a marketplace that never offers rest. Small acts that seem insignificant, such as resisting the urge to buy what is unnecessary, become steps away from Egypt. And when communities join together in this, when thousands or millions align their steps, it creates a current strong enough to shift the ground beneath an entire economy. There is a vision that rises gently when contemplating this departure. It is the sight of a long road stretching out of a land that once demanded everything from those who lived in its shadow.
Upon that road, the movement is quiet but steady. Families choosing nourishment over consumption, workers choosing stillness over exhaustion, communities choosing mutual support over dependency on systems that have failed them. In this vision, the footsteps of those leaving are not hurried. They are intentional, as though each person senses that leaving Babylon is not merely an outward act, but a cleansing of the inner landscape. For Babylon survives as long as desire obeys it. The moment desire is freed, the walls begin to tremble. And so the mass blackout becomes more than a week without spending. It becomes the first breath of a people rediscovering their agency, discovering that the sea they feared is already parting beneath their feet. The ancient exodus made empires tremble. The new one, though quieter, carries the same essence. It is the recognition that when those who sustain the system walk away, the system must face itself at last. In a night when consciousness slipped from the edge of waking and into the deeper currents where time bends and memory fades into prophecy, I was led into a realm where history appeared not as a sequence, but as a landscape. There before me rose a great American city, glowing as if wrapped in a mantle of electric fire. Every tower pulsed with advertisements, every street gleamed beneath fluorescent clouds, every screen flashed with the fever of commerce. The air itself seemed stitched with the restless hum of desire. I watched the city as one who stands outside its motion, unseen yet seeing, and then something shifted. The lights did not vanish all at once. They dimmed in slow, deliberate waves, as though an invisible hand was sweeping its palm across the skyline. The brilliance collapsed section by section until entire districts sank quietly into shadow. The billboards that had screamed their invitations a moment before now stood like mute slabs. Streets that had throbbed with traffic fell into a stillness so complete that even the wind seemed unwilling to break it. People emerged from stores and parking garages, but instead of the usual frantic rush, they looked upward with hesitation, as though sensing a larger presence moving through the silence. This was no blackout of wires and power grids. It felt intentional, as if the city itself were exhaling after holding its breath for too many years. And as the darkness thickened, a voice moved through me, not with sound, but with certainty, speaking into the quiet center where physical hearing cannot reach. This is the silence you read in Revelation. This is the moment when Babylon ceases her song of merchandise, when the engines that fed on human longing finally run out of fuel. I felt the weight of those words as if I had stepped inside the hollowed ribs of an empire that did not yet know it was dying. The noise of buying and selling had fallen away, and in its absence, something older and truer began to rise. I was shown another scene far from the dim towers. In small homes scattered across suburbs and rural roads, families gathered at tables lit by warm, modest lamps. No one clutched shopping bags. No one hurried through digital catalogs.
Children leaned against their parents as pages of scripture were opened. The soft murmur of conversation replaced the frantic beat of consumption. Hands joined in prayer where once they had clutched the latest bargains. There was no extravagance on these tables, but there was fullness. I understood then that the outer blackout was only the surface of the deeper one. What was truly dimming was the inner altar where consumerism had long demanded worship. The idols of urgency, comparison, vanity, and appetite flickered as though starved of attention. In their fading glow, another kind of light began to push through, quiet yet unwavering, rising from within those who had forgotten it was still there. The voice returned, not dictating but revealing. When the false light dies, the true one awakens. When desire loosens its grip, the heart remembers its hunger for wisdom. When Babylon dims the soul, sees what it could not see before. In that moment, I was allowed to understand the blackout, not as a collapse, but as an unveiling. It was a stripping away of illusions so deeply woven into daily life that people mistook them for truth. It was the first rupture in a spell cast by endless buying, endless wanting, endless chasing. And it was also an act of mercy for a nation drowning in noise cannot hear the whisper of its own conscience. As the vision thinned and the borders of waking returned, I carried with me a single clear certainty. The darkening of America was not a punishment. It was a summons, a call to step out of the glare that blinds and into the shadow where seeing becomes possible again. A call to remember that a people who turn from Babylon's glow do not lose light. They recover it. When the ancient words of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, rise in the mind, they do not appear merely as warnings written for a distant people. They unfold like a code describing the inner structure of an economic world built on imbalance. The phrases that the stranger shall be the head and thou shalt be the tail, thou shalt borrow and not lend, thou shalt come down very low are more than poetic judgment. They reveal what happens when a people lose alignment with the laws that keep dignity and provision intact. Under that curse, labor is abundant, but ownership is scarce, effort multiplies, but inheritance evaporates, and the system itself tilts toward those with power while crushing those with little. Across generations, this pattern becomes a landscape, a terrain where one group rises and another sinks, not by accident, but by design. Observing the economic reality of Black America and much of the working class, the parallels are unmistakable. Entire communities survive on borrowed money at interest rates designed to drain rather than sustain. Wages stretch thin across rent, medicine, food, transportation, still arrive short. Credit scores dictate opportunity more harshly than character or skill. Predatory loans, payday traps, and unavoidable debt spiral into financial bondage deeper than chains made of iron. The pressure is constant, invisible, yet relentless, like a weight placed at the back of the neck that cannot be shrugged off. This is not coincidence and not merely mismanagement. It resembles a script already written, a pattern described in Deuteronomy long before these modern institutions existed. And from that resemblance emerges the central theological hypothesis of the original message that the people who carry the economic marks of the curse may be the very descendants of those ancient Israelites still living under its shadow. Whether one accepts the hypothesis literally or symbolically, the pattern itself is impossible to ignore. A people whose labor built nations without compensation, whose families were broken by force, whose progress was resisted century after century, whose wealth was extracted, while their communities were starved, stand in the same position, described by the ancient curse, a position of striving without advancement, of giving without receiving, of sustaining a system that does not sustain them. Yet beneath that heavy recognition lies a truth often overlooked. The curse was never written as a life sentence. It was a consequence, not an identity. It was a condition, not a destiny. The same book that records the curse also hints at its end, at the moment when a people awaken, turn, and step out from the structures that held them captive. Every curse has an expiration when consciousness returns and alignment is restored. And this is where the mass blackout enters the story, not as rebellion, but as a symbolic step toward breaking a yoke long believed unbreakable. It becomes a small yet profound act of refusing to feed a system built on imbalance, is the first crack in the wall made not by force, but by withdrawal. If Deuteronomy describes the fall into economic slavery, then moments like this hint at the rise out of it. But the departure does not begin only on the level of a nation. It begins inside each person who hears this call. The curse of being the tail rather than the head is lived out in daily decisions, in habits shaped by fear exhaustion or the need for escape. Babylon is not only the external structure of predatory economies, it is also the internal impulse to spend without clarity, to chase relief through objects, to soothe pain with purchases, to accept living on borrowed time and borrowed money as normal. Breaking the curse means turning inward to find where Babylon has built its altars inside the heart. Many discover it in the recurring anxiety about bills and the dependence on credit to survive, in the cycle of buying things that add momentary comfort but long term burden, in the belief that money must always slip away faster than it arrives. The blackout becomes an invitation to pause these patterns long enough to truly see them. It is not just a protest, it is a mirror held before the soul. Every choice to save instead of spend loosens one strand of the yoke. Every refusal to buy into the frenzy of consumption exposes the illusion that Babylon controls survival. Every moment of financial self awareness is a step toward reclaiming authority over one's own life. And if a nation of people takes these steps together, even briefly, the spiritual weight of the curse begins to weaken. Yokes built over centuries do not shatter in an instant, yet they crack when a people rediscover the power of restraint and collective will. The blackout is the beginning of such cracks. It is a reminder that liberation often starts quietly with a single decision repeated thousands of times across thousands of households. It is an opportunity offered by God not to escape responsibility, but to reclaim identity. And identity always begins with remembering that captivity is not the final word. The curse is not the final word. The system is not the final word. The moment people remember who they are, the yoke begins to loosen. History does not move in straight lines. It spirals, returning to the same points with deeper gravity, each time as if the soul of a nation must relearn what it once knew but forgot. When I look across the long arc of American struggle, I see not isolated events, but repeating pulses of the same law, the same spiritual equation that empires always hope people will never recognize. The Montgomery bus boycott was one such pulse, a quiet storm disguised as a simple refusal to ride. For 381 days, the buses carried the weight of their absence. each empty seat becoming a silent verdict against a system built on humiliation. The power of that moment did not come from riots or fire, but from subtraction. People who had been told they possessed no leverage suddenly discovered that the economy relied on their footsteps more than they relied on the buses. The company bled money, the city felt the tremor. And the empire that enforced segregation learned that withdrawal is a sharper blade than confrontation. Years later, Operation Breadbasket carried the same essence but in a new form. The phrase, "do not buy where you cannot work," was not a slogan but a strategy born of clarity. Communities refused to fund businesses that refused to recognize their humanity. The economic pressure grew invisible, yet unavoidable, turning boardrooms uneasy, forcing corporations to hire, promote, and invest where they had long withheld. Again, the same law emerged that money flows according to the values of those who direct it. And when those who suffer injustice redirect their spending, the oppressor is no longer shielded by distance or power. The ripples reached executives who had never walked the neighborhoods they profited from, teaching them that economic indifference carries consequences. More recently, after the murder of George Floyd, the cycle returned with a sharper edge. Corporations that had ignored racial inequity for decades suddenly pledged billions, shifted branding, expanded diversity programs, and tried to align themselves with the language of justice. Not because moral clarity had finally pierced their hearts, but because a wave of economic pressure rolled toward them. The fear of lost customers and collapsing public image struck deeper than any political negotiation could. Their reaction was not compassion, it was self preservation disguised as virtue. Behind the statements and promises was the familiar tremble of Babylon being shaken. When examining these events side by side, a pattern emerges so consistent that it reveals a spiritual principle. Whenever an oppressed community withdraws its labor, its money, or its participation, the empire built upon exploitation is forced to bend. It is not sentiment that drives change, it is the recognition that without the energy of those it exploits, the empire loses its power. This is the law of sowing and reaping, not as a metaphor, but as an economic reality. An empire that sows injustice eventually reaps resistance, and resistance in the form of withdrawal becomes an earthquake beneath its foundation. What makes the year 2025 distinct is the scale and the timing. The mass blackout is not confined to a single city or directed at one corporation. It does not rely on charismatic leaders or centralized organizations. It spreads like a wind carried by the collective memory of past victories and the accumulated frustration of a people who have watched the same pattern repeat across generations. It arrives not as a protest alone, but as a reckoning, a moment where the spiral of history tightens into a precise point. In the vision that rises when I contemplate this moment, history appears as a vast vortex swirling downward in wide circles at first, then drawing tighter with each cycle. Montgomery was one ring, Operation Breadbasket another. The uprisings of 2020 formed a ring in which fire and sorrow fused into resolve. And now this blackout emerges as the next spiral, but with a deeper dimension, one that does not only touch the laws of the land, but the architecture of the nation's spiritual economy. In this deeper layer, the blackout is not simply about withholding money, it is about confronting the energetic imbalance that has long fed the empire. Every empire extracts not only labor, but attention, desire, hope, and fear. These currents form an unseen economy, And when a people reclaim these inner energies, the outer structures begin to fracture. The blackout becomes the outward expression of an inward awakening, the realization that the empire is powerful only because the people have given it permission. As the spiral turns again in 2025, the cleansing reaches further. It presses not only on laws and corporations, but on the unseen assumptions that have shaped American life for decades. It exposes dependencies, reveals illusions, and disrupts the hypnotic rhythm of consumption. It calls forth a deeper memory within the people, a memory of autonomy and spiritual authority. And the empire, sensing the shift, grows uneasy for this cycle, touches not just policy, but the very soul of the system. This is why the blackout matters. It is not a repetition, but an intensification, a new ring in the spiral where the pressure rises and the illusions thin. It is a step toward a future where the people no longer tremble before the empire, but the empire trembles before the people. When observing the landscape of modern America, it becomes difficult to deny that multiple signs converge like storm fronts meeting over the same sky. The widening gap between wealth and poverty stretches to extremes unseen in previous generations, forming a canyon so deep that entire communities vanish inside it. Debt coils around households like a tightening rope, from student loans to medical bills to the silent grip of credit cards, creating an invisible prison that few escape. The government stumbles from one crisis to another, trapped in its own paralysis, unable to move with clarity or compassion. Policies rise that cut support from the poor while expanding the reach of those already overflowing with advantage. These elements do not stand alone. They form a chorus, a dark consonance that echoes the warnings written in scripture about the days when nations would shake hearts, would faint, and the structures once trusted would reveal their fragility. When reading the prophetic texts, one finds descriptions of seas, roaring nations, perplexed people searching for answers while the old certainties fall away. It is not the catastrophes themselves that mark the season, but the disorientation they produce, the feeling that the world is shifting underfoot. That sensation now pulses through America like a tremor beneath the skin. Yet alongside this shaking, something else unfolds, something less visible, but no less powerful: the acceleration of knowledge. Information travels now with a velocity once unimaginable. A thought whispered on a phone becomes a national movement within days. A call for a blackout carried by a few determined voices spreads through algorithms and handheld screens until it becomes a collective act shaping the trajectory of the nation. This acceleration mirrors an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of knowledge increasing in the last days, not merely in data or intelligence, but in awareness. Things once concealed become visible. Systems once unquestioned become exposed. People who felt isolated in their suffering begin to realize they are part of a larger pattern. And as knowledge accelerates, so does awakening. Among the most striking currents in this awakening is the rising recognition among many African Americans who identify as descendants of ancient Israel, a movement often called Hebrew Israelite. This is not a mere trend or an intellectual exercise. It is a reclaiming of story, a restoration of identity stripped away through centuries of bondage. It points back to scripture not as distant history, but as living truth. The fact that so many young people turn to the Bible with fresh eyes, searching for themselves within its pages, suggests not the decline of faith, but its renewal. It feels like rainfall on dry ground, the fulfillment of the promise that the Spirit would be poured out on all flesh. Dreams awaken, visions return, The dormant memory of an ancient covenant stirs again. Yet the movement is not confined to one community alone. Something broader is occurring across the American heartland. People of every race and background are beginning to question the authority structures that govern their money, their time, and their attention. They sense that the economic system shaping their lives is not neutral and not concerned with their well being. They feel the strain of constant productivity, the pressure to consume, the subtle fear of falling behind. In that discomfort, questions begin to rise. Who truly benefits from this system? Who decides what prosperity means? Who determines the value of human labor? These are not merely economic questions. They are spiritual ones because money has become the altar at which the nation worships. And when people begin to question the altar, they are already halfway to leaving it. The blackout movement becomes a catalyst in this awakening. It reveals how little power the system has when people stop feeding it. It exposes the illusion of consumer freedom by showing how much change emerges the moment consumption pauses. It becomes a collective whisper that says the power was never in the empire. It was always in the people. The turbulence of the nation, the acceleration of knowledge, the exhaustion of the poor, the awakening of identity, all converge into a single insight. America is not simply experiencing political dysfunction or economic instability, it is undergoing a spiritual diagnosis. The fractures are symptoms, the unrest is a sign, the awakening is the prescription. And the blackout becomes a symbolic moment when the nation looks into a mirror and sees not only what it has become, but what it might yet be if its people choose clarity over illusion and truth over habit. This is the turning within the turning, the deeper spiral beneath the visible events. It is not the end of the world, but the end of an era and the beginning of another where identity is reclaimed, systems are questioned, and the soul of a people begins to rise. When imagining the 7 days of economic silence, the scene does not unfold as chaos, but as a slow tightening around the structures that once felt immovable. In the first 24 hours, corporate dashboards begin flashing downward trends. Retailers who built their fortunes on predictable holiday surges watch their revenue plunge like a stone dropped into deep water. Stock tickers vibrate with uncertainty, first dipping cautiously, then jolting as analysts scramble to explain what cannot be explained within conventional logic. Boardrooms fill with executives who had prepared for record profits but now sit in a tension thick enough to feel like a physical presence. They speak in the language of damage control, of emergency promotions, of frantic discount codes, but the silence outside their windows swallows every tactic. Meanwhile, major news outlets attempt to soften the impact, describing the blackout as symbolic fringe or overestimated. Their tone carries a forced calm, the kind used when a storm is visible on the horizon, but no one wants to announce it. Commentators minimize experts, dismiss anchors, smile with unease. Yet beneath their words, the truth grows heavier because the silence of this scale cannot be ignored. As the days progress, Babylon responds exactly as ancient patterns predict. First comes denial, the system pretending nothing has shifted. Then comes irritation, accusing participants of irresponsibility, selfishness, or ignorance. When those tactics fail, the tone turns persuasive, even flattering, with corporations promising reforms, community programs, diversity pledges, and so called investments aimed at winning back the very people they once overlooked. Babylon always negotiates when its survival is at stake.
But beyond these familiar reactions, something else appears, something the system cannot control. Two parallel roads begin forming across the nation. On the first road is Babylon itself, shaking quietly beneath the pressure, performing strength, while feeling the foundation crack. Corporate strategists run scenario after scenario trying to map what happens if 7 days become 14 or if 14 become a season.
For the first time, they imagine a world where consumers do not behave predictably and where the people they once considered passive finally hold the economic reins. The fear there is not loud. It is cold and calculated, the kind that spreads in whispers through institutions once convinced of their permanence. On the second road, however, the atmosphere is different. There, inside homes and small gatherings, families discover a slower rhythm. Without the pull of malls or digital checkouts, they cook together, talk longer, reflect more deeply. Some begin sharing resources with neighbors, offering rides, trading, produce, pooling skills. Churches and community groups experiment with small internal markets, selling necessities at fair prices or exchanging goods without money at all. What begins as temporary adaptation becomes a subtle exploration of a different way to live, a way where people rely less on systems that drain them and more on one another. It is along this second road that the idea of a parallel economy begins to take shape. Money circulates not outward in mega corporations, but inward within communities. Savings grow because consumption shrinks. People learn to store food smartly, to repair rather than replace, to invest in small businesses that treat them as more than data points. In this emerging landscape, the blackout becomes less about deprivation and more about discovery. It reveals that many of the things people believed they needed were nothing but habits sold to them by Babylon. It shows that economic independence begins not with abundance, but with awareness. This newfound awareness does not fade when the 7 days end. It lingers, asking questions that cannot be unasked. Why return to the old patterns? Why give strength back to a system that trembled when touched? Why not continue building the alternative one decision at a time? From these questions emerges the first chapter of a longer movement, a series of future boycotts, strategic pauses, communal savings plans, and cooperative ventures. Individuals begin practicing mini blackouts every month, then every week, then as a lifestyle. Communities form buying clubs, resource pools, and shared emergency funds. A culture of self reliance and spiritual clarity grows in the space once occupied by impulse buying and ceaseless craving. This cycle of blackout and awakening becomes the quiet revolution that Babylon fears most because it signals a shift not only in behavior but in consciousness. The empire can withstand anger, but it cannot withstand clarity. It can endure a protest, but it cannot survive a people who no longer depend on it. And that is what the 7 day silence initiates. It marks the moment when a population looks at Babylon not with envy or submission, but with detachment. The spell breaks, the idols dim, and a new economic life begins to form beneath the surface, more grounded, more humane, more aligned with the inner light that consumerism once obscured. The blackout is not the end of Babylon. It is the beginning of the withdrawal that will dissolve her from within. As the 7 days of silence draw near, the call that rises is not abstract or symbolic. It is practical, grounded, and measurable because spiritual awakening without disciplined action becomes little more than sentiment. For the blackout to hold its power, preparation must begin long before the first day arrives. This means securing enough food, medicine, and household essentials so that No one is pressed into spending out of necessity. It means paying bills early, clearing the calendar where possible, informing employers, family, community members, and creating a week of purposeful stillness rather than frantic improvisation. This level of readiness is not merely logistical, it is spiritual strategy. It is removing every foothold Babylon might use to pull someone back into its cycle during those 7 days. For many, this preparation becomes their first exercise in intentional stewardship. They learn to examine what is essential, what is habit, what feeds life, and what empties it. They begin recognizing the difference between consumption born of need and consumption triggered by emotional reflex. This clarity opens the doorway to a deeper discipline, one that aligns with the theme of saving money for the blackout, is not simply a protest, but a training ground in financial autonomy. Alongside practical readiness, the redirection of spending becomes a vital thread woven through the entire movement. The goal is not merely to withhold from major corporations during the blackout, but to reshape spending habits before and after it. Supporting small businesses, especially Black owned companies, local farmers, community cooperatives, and independent artisans, becomes an act of economic restoration. Each purchase becomes a vote for the world one wishes to live in.
Money begins circulating within communities rather than draining outward into corporate structures that offer little in return. This shift is quiet yet revolutionary, and as it spreads, people begin to see their economic lives not as isolated struggles, but as interconnected threads forming a collective tapestry. Within this economic transformation lies a deeper truth, one captured through the metaphor of the spiritual armor described in ancient scripture.
Each piece of the armor becomes a discipline required for this moment. The belt of truth becomes the clarity needed to recognize manipulation, marketing, illusions, and false promises that Babylon uses to control desire. When one fastens this truth around the inner life, emotional spending loses its force. The breastplate of righteousness becomes the commitment to integrity in financial decisions, refusing to support companies that exploit labor or extract wealth without reinvesting into the people who sustain them. It is choosing alignment over convenience, character over impulse. The shoes of peace become the intentional posture needed when economic pressure rises. Instead of reacting with fear or anger, individuals move with calm discernment, refusing to let Babylon dictate their steps. Peace becomes the soil in which financial discipline grows. The shield of faith becomes the defense against doubt, against the internal voice that whispers that small decisions do not matter, that personal habits cannot shift national structures. Faith absorbs these arrows and reminds the heart that every great transformation begins with the smallest act of consistency. The helmet of salvation becomes the protection of identity, the reminder that one's worth is not measured by possession status or the speed of consumption. It shields the mind from Babylon's message that value must be purchased rather than lived. And the sword of the Spirit, the word of truth, becomes the power to cut through the narratives of scarcity, fear, and urgency that fuel the economy of exploitation. With this sword, individuals reclaim their authority and sever the patterns that once controlled them. In this merging of financial practice and spiritual discipline, the blackout becomes something far larger than a 7 day pause. It becomes a school, living classroom in which individuals learn to save not only money, but themselves. They discover that emotional spending is a form of bondage, that budget chaos is an altar where Babylon collects offerings, and that saving is not merely financial behavior, but spiritual resistance. They learn to ask a new question. Does my money serve my purpose, or does it serve Babylon? The more a person practices this awareness, the more they feel the old chains slipping. The blackout marks only the beginning of this transformation. As habits shift, people realize how much of their financial life has been shaped by impulse rather than intention. They discover that saving becomes easier when desire is no longer inflamed by constant exposure to advertising and comparison. They find that money acquires new meaning when it is no longer spent to fill emptiness, but reserved to build a future aligned with purpose. And as this shift takes root across thousands of households, what emerges is not simply a better budget, but a new kind of collective strength. This is the art of saving in a time of judgment, not as fear, but as wisdom, not as deprivation, but as liberation. For when a people master their finances, they weaken Babylon more than any protest ever could. When they learn to direct their resources with clarity, discipline, and spiritual conviction, they step into a sovereignty that no empire can easily shake. And in that sovereignty, the first cracks of deliverance appear. I speak now from a place that feels neither inside time nor outside it, a quiet ridge where moments gather before they descend into the world of men. From here, I have watched the patterns of nations rise and fold like waves, each crest shaped by the desires of the people beneath it. And in this stillness, as I look back over all that has been revealed in these visions, I sense the weight of a truth that is no longer approaching, but already touching the edges of this land. For years, I saw fragments, only sparks, without form scenes that slipped away before meaning could settle. Yet, as the 7 day silence drew nearer, the fragments aligned. The lights dimming over America, the trembling of Babylon, the awakening of identity, the stirring of households learning to stand outside the marketplace that once ruled them. All these separate threads have woven themselves into one tapestry, and I recount them now. I do so not as a teacher, but as one who has witnessed and is compelled to testify. I saw the engines of the old economy trembling long before anyone thought to withdraw their labor. I saw boardrooms filled with confident men falter in their spirit as the first signs of disobedience appeared across the land. I saw an empire that believed itself eternal suddenly confronted with the truth that its power was borrowed and could be taken back. And saw ordinary people forgotten in the shadows of corporate towers rise in a way no census could measure, not through revolt, not through violence, but through refusal. A refusal to serve Babylon's hunger, a refusal to sacrifice their purpose on the altar of endless consumption, a refusal to forget who they were. As these scenes unfold, why, why? It said that the shaking of Babylon was never meant to destroy the people, only the illusions that held them captive. It said that every empire must one day face the truth of what it has built, and every people must one day decide whether to continue feeding the system that drains them or step into the landscape of freedom waiting just beyond its borders. And as I listened, I saw something deeper than economic change. I saw the birth of a new discipline rising within the hearts of those who once felt powerless. They were learning to save steadily, to spend with intention, to choose simplicity over spectacle, to keep their money within their communities instead of scattering it in distant corporate vaults. They were learning to examine their desires, to see which ones belonged to them and which had been planted by Babylon's constant whisper. They were learning to replace impulse with clarity, fear, with faith, captivity, with purpose. In these small decisions, I saw a scale tipping slow at first, then with growing momentum, as more people awoke to the truth that the greatest wealth is not stored in banks, but in the sovereignty of a disciplined mind. And beyond this discipline, I saw compassion rising, families teaching one another how to prepare communities, sharing resources, neighbors, gathering not out of crisis, but out of intention. It was as if the blackout cracked something open, not merely in the nation's economy, but in its spirit. What emerged was not panic, but possibility, not collapse, but cleansing, not despair, but recalibration. As these scenes faded, I asked the voice what all this meant in the larger story of this land. And the answer came without hesitation. It said that America stands at a threshold where two paths diverge. One path leads deeper into Babylon's glare, where consumption grows frantic and the soul weakens until it can no longer distinguish desire from emptiness. The other path leads into the territory of awakening, where the people reclaim their agency and build a new order grounded in restraint, cooperation, and spiritual clarity. And then the voice said something that pressed against my spirit with the force of a command. It said that the blackout is not the end, but the announcement. It is the first trumpet of a slow but unstoppable exodus. An exodus not from a nation, but from a mindset. An exodus not across physical land, but across the inner terrain of the heart. As the final image dissolved, I felt a question rising for those who will hear these words. Not a question meant to judge, but one meant to awaken. Will you return to Babylon once the lights come back on, or will you continue walking toward the freedom already stirring inside you? What you choose in the quiet will shape what this nation becomes. So I speak this now as both witness and companion. The days ahead will test you, but they will also reveal you. Walk with intention, spend with clarity, save with purpose, pray without ceasing. Keep your heart steady as the old structures tremble. For those who choose the path of awakening will not walk into darkness, but into a dawn Babylon cannot dim. And the one who calls you out of Babylon will also lead you into the land where your spirit can finally breathe.